Hello everybody, I'm just another game developer, and today I'm going to teach you about how Gearbox broke records with their 17.75 million guns in their series Borderlands with random number generation. Random number generation, or RNG, is a method for computing data in a less artificial way. This means that it's going to appear more natural to the user. Gearbox uses RNG to randomly determine every dropped and or looted gun's parts. This means that they had multiple models for the stock, the body, the barrel, and the scope of each weapon. This makes it so that they have a more vast number of possibilities that a gun could have, and with all those combinations, it equaled up to 17.75 million guns. This allowed for less data on the hard drive, which makes the game generally perform better because there's less to be loaded. What I have today is a very small generator compared to Borderlands. It has over 500 possibilities. It's written in C# and it's made in Unity. So I'm going to show you basically the overall of what it is, and maybe in the future I'll make a tutorial. So when we jump into Unity, you'll see that I have a really simple generator, which it essentially just generates a random weapon. Each of them have slightly different models since I'm not a 3D modeler. They each have slightly different barrels, stocks, and bodies. And they all have different names, which also comes into play in making separate guns, since technically it's a different gun if it has a different name. It also determines the type of gun, the manufacturer, the damage, the fire rate, and the accuracy. And this is all random. If you move the slider, it'll multiply by the damage. So if you move it all the way up to 61, you can get guns with up to 1,000, 2,000, 800, and so on. So I'm going to show you how I did this in the code. Starting off, I made a variable for GameObject for a gun template, which I basically essentially just had one empty GameObject, and within that empty GameObject, 3 other empty GameObjects for representing the stock, the body, and the barrel. Then I set up an array for the stock, the body, and the barrel so that I could each call models from each of these. Then I had a string for if the manufacturer was Dahl, Hyperion, Jacobs, or TDR, since I'm only using 4 manufacturers rather than 8, since it's a much smaller scale generator. I have a private string for manufacturer, since we don't need to access it from any other script. I also have 5 other arrays for prefixes in case of any effects that it may have, or just standard effects if it doesn't have one. To start, I made level equal to a game object that is a UI component that will show the level. Then in update, I made a text equal to the right, whatever the value of the slider is. So that's all just UI stuff. That has nothing to do with the generation. To get to the generation, I set up a debug.log. That way I know when I'm generating a weapon and when I stop generating a weapon down here. Then I destroy whatever gun there already is. That way it doesn't have multiple guns to calculate the stats for. I have variables inside of it to have a random gun type, stock, body, barrel, prefix, and effect. All of these determine random numbers for the gun type, the stock, which pulls a random model from the stock array, a body, which does the same thing, and a barrel selection. The prefix selection pulls from a list of strings that I set up, and the effect selector pulls from a list of strings, which is just fire, shock, corrosion, and slag, which determines the gun's effect. Next, I set up a game object, and I made it so that it instantiates a new gun and set it to 0. And then I did this quaternion.euler just to give the gun a random rotation every time it spawns. Then I made the gun's children equal to a mesh, and I got the mesh by getting the stock selection so that it got the mesh from whatever stock it picked out and applied it to the mesh of that child, which is just the empty game object within an empty game object. Next, for the gun type, I made a switch statement, so if the gun type was equal to 0 from this random number generator, then it would be pistol. If it was 1, it'd be submachine gun, and so on. Next, for the body selection, whatever manufacturer manufactures the body determines the manufacturer for the whole gun. So whatever the body is, I made, if it got 0, it was Dahl. If it was 1, it was Hyperion. So I did that the same way I did with the gun type. Next, for the barrel, I did a switch, and the barrel, since it contains most of the stats, I'll go through this a little slower. So I got the component from the gun, which is gun stats, which is another script that I have right here. And it gets the damage from it, and it sets a random number between 15 and 20. And it also takes into effect, it multiplies it by the slider value and divides it by 3. That way we don't get numbers like 60,000 and stuff. That's just too ridiculous. And then I did the same with the fire rate, just a little more nerfed numbers, and the same with the accuracy. And I did this for about all of them except the barrel selections differentiate, so you're not going to get the same number every time. This one can go up to 100, this one can go up to 120. And this basically just means whatever the manufacturer is those. Next, I made a switch statement for the effect selector. If it was 1, the effect would be fire. If it was 4, the effect was shock. If it was 7, the effect was corrosion. If it was 10, the effect was slag. The reason I did it this way is because since there's no else statements in the switches, I had it so that it had less of a chance to pick these numbers. So it wasn't if it was 1, if it was 4, because I just have a bunch of if statements. So every other number besides 1, 4, 7, and 10, it's not going to have an effect. Then I applied the prefix to whatever the prefix was that it selected, and I set the manufacturer to whatever it was, and then I debug.log generation done. That way I know that the generation went through without any problems. Next, let's take a look at the gun stats. I have UI here just so that it calls whatever the name of the gun is, the damage, all that. That's just for showing the stuff that has nothing to do with the actual gun's performance. So at the start, I defined all of these UI elements. Then I called assign name. So it's every time I want that to spawn, I want it to assign a name to it. And assign name is basically if the effect is fire, select from fire prefixes a random name. However, if it's not, and if it doesn't have an effect, then call from whatever these manufacturers are and get their names and then apply it to that gun. In the update, since it's not going to be randomly changing, I set all of the UI elements to whatever they corresponded to. So essentially, that is what Gearbox did. They had random number generators generating all of these different types of data, except instead of having 3 or 4 possibilities like I had, they had up to probably 20 in certain areas, and it just made for all of these random guns. Like here I have a psychotic quick shot, metal eating sheriff, which is a corrosion weapon, corrosive pirate, badass splozer, psychotic bamf. So they basically just had all of these names and models from a database and applied it to all of them. I'll show you that right here I only have 4 barrels, 4 bodies, and 4 stocks. So I don't have as much or nearly as much customization or generation power as they have, but this is essentially how you do it. So if you ever wanted to make a game where it randomly generated weapons, this is how you do it. Anyway, thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more how it's done in game development videos.